Now I have the great honor to present our first keynote speaker for today's symposium, Jean-Hubert Martin, who joined the Musée National d'Art Moderne in Paris as curator already in 1971. Also became the director of Centre Pompidou from 1987 to 1990. You have also curated many exhibitions, among them the very legendary famous Magicien de la Terre in 1989 and many others. The title of your talk is Cold War and Freedom of Expression. Welcome.
By the end of the 70s, the Cold War was still operating. France was torn between the two imperialisms. It was obsessed by the American bulldozer and was trying to find a third way with Europe. There were nevertheless close ties with USSR, especially on the cultural level. Politicians love, for all sorts of diplomatic reasons, to talk about the ties between cultures. It is too often just an empty political cant. The communists were very good at that with their famous people's friendship. Nevertheless, my experience of working in Russia tells me that in the case of France and Russia, it is not a hollow expression. There are real links and similarities between both cultures, at least until now. The future is unpredictable. When Pontus Hultén arrived as a director of the Musée National d'Art Moderne in 1973, he came with the idea of starting his program with 3 personal exhibitions: Duchamp, Picabia, and Malevich. Whether he had already the idea of the 2 exhibitions showing Paris relations with West and East, the so-called ping-pong exhibitions, is not sure. At a certain point, he even thought of remaking the machine exhibition that he had done at the MoMA a few years before in 1968. But then he took the decision to make the 2 exhibitions, Paris-New York in 1977, and the planned Paris-Moscow-Berlin, which should have happened in 1978, in that order. Because he wanted to show how the ideas and the artists themselves were moving first extremely quickly from Paris to Moscow, and then how they migrated back west with this amount of Eastern European artists settling in Montparnasse after World War I. Then he traveled several times to Moscow and had meetings with the Ministry of Culture, which at first proposed the usual collections of French avant-garde with Gauguin, Cézanne, Picasso, Matisse, and so on, assembled by Shtukin and Morozov, the 2 famous collectors at the beginning of the 20th century. But then we explained Pontus that these works had been shown already several times in Paris within the bilateral cultural exchanges between France and USSR, and also that the goal of the exhibition, that Pontus knew, of course, was to try to force the Russians to show their own historical avant-garde that had been hidden in the storages of their museum since Stalin. The situation was paradoxical because the Russians knew French so-called bourgeois avant-garde painting quite well, thanks to these collections, and totally ignored their own historical avant-garde because of a strict censorship. The advantage of the Centre Beaubourg, as it was called at that time, was that it was created as an independent administrative entity which allowed it to negotiate directly with the Soviet ministry without having to report to the French ministries of culture or foreign affairs. It was an essential factor which contributed a lot to the success of the enterprise. Finally, the talks led to an agreement in 1977 with the condition that the exhibition was restricted to Paris-Moscow, cancelling Berlin. We decided then to organize Paris-Berlin within 1 year. It was an incredible challenge, which would be impossible today, and it opened in 1978. Paris-Moscow was then scheduled for 1979. At the request of the Russian, a two-party curatorship was set up with regular meetings every few months in both cities. This was, of course, made to allow our Russian colleagues to travel to Paris. Surprisingly, they proposed to show the exhibition afterwards in Moscow. All the intellectuals in Paris were laughing at us, treating us as total naive, and additionally to be accomplices to the Gulag. In fact, the exhibition was shown a year and a half later at the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. It can be seen today as a first sign of the breakup of USSR and of the coming glasnost and perestroika. The General Secretary of the Communist Party, Brezhnev, visited the exhibition and approved it. The director of the museum, Irina Antonova, was scared to death and could breathe again when Brezhnev wrote in a positive comment in the visitor's book after having seen the show. The context of the Cold War in daily life in Moscow at that time is not easy to describe. There were lots of rules inherited from the Stalinistic period that were still more or less followed. Almost nobody believed the government and official news. Fear and lies were the most common attitudes, and unfortunately, that has not changed much till today. According to the old rules, Russians were not allowed to invite foreigners at home, but artists and intellectuals were breaking the rule. This is how we met lots of non-official artists and liberal art historians who helped us in our research. Then they were sometimes summoned by the KGB for a questioning that ended up in telling some banalities. Everybody had in mind the Bulldozer exhibition of 1974, where the works of the living so-called non-official artists had in an open-air exhibition were destroyed. Some of Kabakov's works were just copies of random regulation that sounded so ridiculous that they constituted as such a criticism of the absurdity of the regime. At each trip, we were bringing suitcases full of art catalogues that we distributed to artists mainly. As it was impossible to purchase any foreign book about the historical Russian avant-garde, and even almost forbidden to own any, the custom officers could have reacted, but they didn't care. They were just checking that we didn't bring any porn magazines. There was not much place for leisure in Moscow. Therefore, each time we arrived at the ministry, they proposed us tickets either for the Bolshoi or for the circus. After a while, we knew the circus program by heart and turned to the Bolshoi that thoroughly bored Pontus. The exhibition was interdisciplinary. The exhibition was interdisciplinary according to the rules of the Centre Beaubourg. It was including painting and sculpture, design and decorative arts, poster and propaganda, literature and theater, photography and film. all fields were showing the relations of French creations in comparison with the Russian ones, with a focus on the direct contact between artists of both countries. Pontus constantly insisted on the human side of this relation story, and especially on the trips and meetings of the artists, ending up in the migration of dozens of Russian artists moving to Paris. For him, it was not a simple story of formal evolution of art, but the narrative of human lives and adventures with their successes and dramas. For the first time, we're shown the Black Square of Malevich, that you see here in the center, as well as his figurative works of the 20s, which were totally unknown at that time. Then the Tatlin's counter-relief, also seen for the first time. His tower, as it is called, but the real name is Monument for the Third International, and his flying machine, which had to be moved and operated with muscular force, and Matyushin's The Movement in Space, just to give you some examples of works that had never been seen before. The amount of works was so important that we had to build an additional mezzanine floor at the Centre Pompidou. The exhibition was often imitated later, but never equaled. For the sake of the exhibition press releases, each exhibition always needs to be the first of one within a certain context. Many exhibitions after Paris Moscow claimed to be the first, but the first one for which the museums were allowed to take the banned works out of the storage was the Paris one. To achieve the task of fighting against obscurantism and censorship, Pontus gathered a battalion of young curators around him. His atypical way to fight this adventurous battle was not military at all. With reference to the anarchists in Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War, he relied on self-management, quoting Kropotkin. There was no hierarchy amongst this little army fighting for freedom of expression, except that Pontus was the general. We were young, just coming out of 68 movements, and convinced that we were working for the supreme value of the liberty, arts being one of its favorite expressions. I use this military metaphor because he was known for his love for medals and for army outfits. He even managed to buy a Russian colonel cap through a taxi driver in Moscow. He loved objects, the things, the surprises offered by material culture, unexpected artifacts for which he had a sort of anthropological affection. Such objects were quite difficult to find in Moscow, but he had a constant curiosity, strolling in shops and even airport shops with the hope to unearth a nugget. Pontus' reactions were often radical, and the vodka, whose taste we shared with our Russian partners, helped a lot. In winter, it helped against the cold, but we didn't stop in spring, and Pontus was certainly not the least drinker. All the dinners were punctuated by toasts with some parable, from which we tried to guess prophecies about the future of the exhibition. And Pontus could show his humor during these thoughts that were given during the dinners. He was often unpredictable. For one of the first meetings where we had to go into details for the list of works, he just didn't show up and left me alone. I then had the task to discuss the loans of a month for the rest of the long negotiations and to find the difficult and acceptable balance between the avant-garde and the social realism or some other conventional movement that the Russians wanted to be prominent. My task over and over was to try to refuse works that were of little interest for us and concentrate on the innovative artists. For instance, there has been an extremely long discussion about Rylov's painting in the blue expanse of 1918, and a symbol of both the return of the migrating birds for spring and the revolution. The everlasting discussion was about the capacity or not of the French public to understand the meaning of the image, as I just found it a very banal and uninteresting paintings in terms of creation. During these dialogues, I often had to oppose their proposal, and I said in French, "Non, mais c'est pas possible." No, it's not possible, which ended up in the nickname that the Russians gave me. I was called Monsieur C'est pas possible. They gave us all nicknames, by the way. They saw us as romanticists of the revolutions and tried to reduce the importance of the revolution in the exhibition, the contrary of what we would have expected as ex-young Marxist educated students. Pontus' strategy was not to be involved in the details of the negotiations that he never explained formally beforehand, proved to be efficient because when there were problems of political level, the chief of the Russian party, Mr. Hultén, would refer directly and confidentially to Pontus, who then discussed the matter with the team to find a solution. This attitude was typical for Pontus, who was anything but a teacher. He was very much aware of the old and everlasting competition between Moscow and Leningrad, how it was called at that time. Because of the important, because of the importance of the collections of both the Russian Museum and the Hermitage Museum, there he thought very important to show our esteem and interest in their collaboration by paying them each time a visit, and to show our esteem and interest in the collaboration, even stopping there first before going to Moscow, thus giving them a priority. We often found the colleagues there more open to the dialogue than in the capital. A good example of Pontus' radical behavior was given during the installation of the exhibition in Moscow. He had a special interest in the Tatlin Tower, which he already had reconstituted for an exhibition at the Moderna Museet in 1968. But because of the complexity of the structure, he realized that this model was not exact, the first one. A second model, including the corrections, was made in Paris under his supervision. Pontus decided to give it the most honorable place in the Pushkin Museum, which is the apse of the prestigious white room, which looks like a church with its 2 rows of columns. The French workers were starting to build it up. When Mrs. Antonova, the director of the museum, came in and shouted that this placement was impossible and wanted to put it away in a much less solemn location, Pontus grasped one of the rods of the tower and said that if it couldn't stay there, he would destroy it. And he won. The tower stayed in its glorifying place. There are, of course, Duchamp's his interest and involvement in reconstruction is one of the major aspects of his career. There are, of course, Duchamp's Grand Verre and Corders for elements. And in this exhibition, Rodchenko's Workers' Club, and the L. Lisitsky Linen Tribune. But later, there were many other experiments, especially in Paris with André Raffray, whose realization of copies he followed very closely. According to an increased public demand for famous works and a reduction of long traveling loans, there is a future for copies of good quality that nowadays techniques can provide. Pontus was a pioneer in this field. He was questioning the concept of uniqueness and authenticity, which is so much linked to the market. One should not forget that in the past, when a painting got a certain success, the artist had copies done by their studios according to the number of demands. One of the political disagreements we had with our partners was about Trotsky. André Breton and him had written and signed together the Manifesto pour un art révolutionnaire indépendant in Mexico in 1938, in strong reaction against the totalitarian regimes and positions taken by Hitler and Stalin. After long discussion, the presence of the Manifesto and a few writings of Trotsky were allowed in a showcase in Paris. But when the exhibition came to Moscow, Pontus had to attend several meetings there to try to convince our partners to accept and deal with this historical fact. Funnily and ironically enough, this discussion took a turn that we would call in French surrealist, because the problem was about the inclusion of an author whose name could not be pronounced even 34 years after Stalin's death. As a result, Pontus gave an opening speech which stressed our strong differences in the conception and interpretation of history. While talking, he was running with sweat. All the French collaborators were wearing at the buttonhole of their jackets a pin in shape of a pick, the weapon used by the KGB agent to kill Trotsky. As a protest, Serge Fauchereau, in charge of literature in this exhibition, and myself, we left the opening just after Pontus' speech. We also disapproved Mrs. Antonova's collaboration with the Galerie Gmurzinska, which had never been part of our contract, the same gallery which is now prosecuted for having sold lots of fake Russian works to collectors, including Peter Ludwig. 2 years before our exhibition in Paris in 1977, the Metropolitan Museum in New York organized an exhibition called Russian and Soviet Painting, curated by the specialist John Bolt. John Bolt was very proud to have succeeded in obtaining loans of a series of works of the historical avant-garde, for which he had got the signed loan forms from the Ministry of Culture. Only at his great surprise, when he opened the crates, the expected suprematist and constructivist works were missing. We were very anxious that they would play such a bad trick with us. Pontus said that if they did so, we would refuse to open the exhibition and cancel it. There was no point to express this fear openly during our meetings. He proposed then we just let spread the rumor. We still don't know if we were listened to in our hotel rooms. No doubt that in the horrible Rossiya Hotel, which has been destroyed now, just opposite of the Kreplin, no doubt that this hotel for foreigners was equipped with microphones. Was our project important enough to be spied? Not sure. Nevertheless, we regularly repeated very loud in our rooms the decision not to open the exhibition if the shipped works didn't correspond exactly to the list of our contract. Actually, not a single work was missing. As said, Pontus could be very radical and at the same time cunning. He could be a trickster. I learned only very late, I think at the time of the opening of the exhibition in Paris, that from the start he had been in touch with the French Communist Party, whose strong ties with Moscow were well known. We don't know how much these contacts may have played a role, but it could only have been positive. It is clear that Pontus considered Paris-Moscow as his most important exhibition among the dozens he has curated or directed. His passion for the role of the artist as an actor of change and transformation of society found there its accomplishment. The authors of the Russian avant-garde had already disappeared, but the exhibition was their revival through their works, finally extracted from the cells where they had been imprisoned for decades. The best sign of this is that in the 90s, he convened each year the team for an anniversary meal at his favorite restaurant, Benoît, near the Centre Pompidou. It always started with the toast, lifting a glass of vodka, before switching to French red wine, a typical way for Pontus to give a material translation to his powerful idea of connecting Paris and Moscow. It needed a Northern European man to realize this cultural bridge. Is it utopian to hope that one day Russians may understand that they belong to our values of democracy and peace, and that they will join them? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's hard to think of it today in the situation we are, a project like this that you were working on with Pontus Hultén. Now we will have a conversation between you, Jean-Hubert Martin, and Claes Britton. So please, Claes, journalist, creative director and author, and who has this year published a biography on Pontus Hultén. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you for inviting us here. And it's lovely to have Jean-Hubert here, who was, without comparison, my most important source in Paris, and perhaps in my whole book. We have met many times and corresponded hugely, and Jean-Hubert has given a lot of time, and I'm very grateful for this. And first, we are going to speak about Paris-Moscow today. But first, before we get into that, I wanted to touch on what you started with, saying that when Pontus came to Paris, he had decided to do these three solar retrospectives with Duchamp, Picabia, and Malevich. And there we must touch especially on Duchamp, because Duchamp was, from the beginning to the end, the most important artist for Pontus. It was almost like a god for him, and so he was very clear that he wanted to start with that in Paris. And today, Duchamp is widely acknowledged as the main inspirer of contemporary art and conceptual art and so on. But this was not at all the case in his own old hometown, Paris, at that time. He had, of course, moved to New York. But please say something about the image of Duchamp at this time. I mean, in 77 and in Paris.
Well, Duchamp was known by a certain circle, I would say, by the circle of artists and some art critics, but a certain circle knew perfectly well Duchamp. I mean, it's not that he was unknown, especially all the artists belonging to the group called the Nouveaux Réalistes were knowing Duchamp and praising him, you know. In a certain way, Duchamp, in the artist circles, played the same role he played for pop art in New York, for the Nouveaux Réalistes, who were their sort of parallel in France. Only, it didn't go beyond this sort of small circle. There is a good example for that. Pontus, the Centre Pompidou was really created at that time in the 70s as a machine for communication. So there were studios inside, there still are studios for television, and to have a sort of direct communication with the TV channels and let know to the largest public possible about living art. And so at a certain point, Pontus had a meeting with the director of one of these TV channels, and the guy said, well, you know, how should we make a program about this artist who is just making some puns and playing with words, and they just couldn't understand that it was such an important artist, and this was very disappointing for Pontus and for us, of course. Nevertheless, the show happened, and it made Duchamp more known than before, of course.
And actually, his brothers were more famous than
for
Duchamp.
Sure. For sure, he had two brothers. He has his brother Duchamp-Villon, that was a sculptor who died unfortunately very early during the First World War. But Jacques Villon, who was a famous painter at that time because he was in this inheritance of Cubism. You know, that is what was the mainstream in Paris and for the Musée d'Art Moderne also. But the whole problem of the Musée d'Art Moderne at that time is that they didn't go beyond that, and then the previous directors couldn't accept the young generation, the Nouveaux Réalistes, or sort of pop art, or equivalent of the pop art in Europe.
Yeah, there is an anecdote there, and you thought it was true that the president of the Centre Pompidou, Robert Bodas, who was Pontus' boss, and he admired him very much, and it's said that Pontus told him that I have decided to open the museum with the Duchamp show, and Robert Bodas said, "Very good, but who is that?" and you said it's true.
It's probably true.
So now we go over to Russia, because as we spoke here, and I mean, when you go around the world and you look in a wider audience in the art world, there's no question that Pontus is most famous for the New York connection, the American connection, what he did for Warhol, Rauschenberg, and so on. And that is natural, I think, because America is dominating the world, and New York is dominating the art world, so that people associate Pontus in a wider with New York still, I mean, Warhol and Rauschenberg. But in reality, this was not really his main interest at all. I mean, American art was really not one of his main passions.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. But he had only this capacity as a very good curator to see where new art is suddenly emerging, and of course it was easy to recognize Rauschenberg and Warhol as very important artists at that time, and so he just thought that he needed to show that. But in fact, he wasn't at all ideologically or economically interested so much in this American imperialism. And he was probably also a little bit suspicious and about the power of the American market, because it was about that, you know. When I arrived at the museum at the beginning of the 70s, just before Pontus arrived, I mean, we were trying to convince, the hierarchy or whatever on the Ministry of Culture to show American art, but it was so difficult in Paris because of the tragedy of the market switching from Paris to New York, and so there was a very strong resistance in Paris against American art, and but Pontus was in a sort of in between and with a lot of misunderstanding, because all the critics thought that he was a sort of, how could I name it, a sort of ambassador, hidden ambassador of American art suddenly arriving in Paris, which he was not. And he was very careful then when purchasing American art, which we all wanted to have, because obviously it was excellent creation. He was very careful always to have the American works of art he purchased given by any sort of sponsors or big collectors who could donate them, and not to buy them with the public money.
Yeah, and there is an anecdote there with this journalist that.
Yeah, he was criticized then by a journalist at a certain point who said, "But Monsieur Hultén, you're only buying American art, and we know that." And then he said to the journalist, "But can you name an American artist whose work I bought?" Then the guy was trying to think how, and suddenly said, "Yes, Beuys." But this, of course, it's a joke, but it shows how the ignorance of the critics in Paris for anything which was foreign, how this ignorance was enormous. You know, they knew only art, French art actually, and they traveled very little at that time, and there was a big ignorance of what was happening abroad.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that even though he worked with introduced the pop art, and that was not really his passion. I mean, it's known that what was his true passion was, of course, Duchamp and Dada and Surrealism and so on. But then also Russian art. That is still much less known in the art world. That this was, you said that he talked much more about Russian art than American art, for example.
Of course, yeah.
So that was a very strong interest from him from the beginning when he started. And actually, you can say that the Russian, the Russian interest formed in a very big way his period in the Centre Pompidou. I mean, he started immediately, and you started immediately doing these Russian shows. Mm-hmm. It's I have likened in the book Pontus to Serge Diaghilev, the founder of the Ballet Russe, who in the early century, as Coco Chanel said that Diaghilev created Russia for foreigners, because it created a huge Russian fashion and in various arts in the early century. And I think that what you did in the 70s was something similar, because you reintroduced Russia to Paris and to the Western world, and not only art. That's important too.
Yeah, certainly. But as I said, there had been always links between France and USSR with exhibition exchanges, you know, and so, well, Pontus, of course, was very much in love with this Russian art, but not at all with the ideology and with the communism. You know, he always said that Lenin was a gangster, you know, because he just took the power and. So when we were in Russia, he was always saying that how can these people be so despising with individuals? You know, that nothing was made for individuals and so on, and so there was not. Was not a sort of melancholy of Russia at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah. But and Paris, Moscow in '79, and a much less known Moscow, Paris in '81, which is at least as important because it was extremely important.
I think it's more important.
Yeah.
I think it's more important. I mean, it was a crazy exhibition. Thousands of people were queuing up around the Pushkin Museum. They were waiting for hours to get in. You know, and it really, well, now as I said, well, now we can consider that it was a sort of first step of the Glasnost. You know, things were just changing slowly, and but it was a tremendous. Encounter of the public with their own past that they ignored, that was, you know, censored
for
doing yeah, it was a catharsis, but much stronger, I would say, than in France. Yes. Funnily enough, the catharsis in Paris among the different ping pong exhibition was much more with Paris Berlin.
Yeah.
If you asked at that time the visitors which one from the three, Paris, New York, Paris, Berlin, or Paris, Moscow, the one they loved more, most of them would say Paris, Berlin. And there was a sort of catharsis also to make this jumelage, as we say, or alliance, you know, again with Germany on a cultural and artistic level. It was very important.
It was a huge success, and
yeah.
In Moscow, Paris, the figure that is mentioned is 650,000 visitors for the Moscow, Paris. That's quite a lot. But there is a huge difference between Paris, Moscow, and the other ping pong exhibitions, Paris, New York, and Paris, Berlin. Paris is a different story, but I mean. And Pontus wrote this himself because those two shows were produced in 1 year each, which is...
I think no, it's not true. It's true for Paris Berlin. For Paris New York, it was more. Yeah. They were 2 years at least. Yeah, no, 2 years I would say.
Yeah, but still, I mean, incredible short time. But Paris Moscow, in reality, as Pontus, you worked 5 years with that because. In reality, it's not only Paris, Moscow, and Moscow, Paris. There was also several other shows included in this endeavor, this Russian endeavor at the Centre Pompidou. And this was a strategy that Pontus used here in Stockholm also. He prepared the audience for a bigger endeavor with having several other exhibitions. And in Paris, it started in 1975 in the Knack, before the centre was opened, in the Museet Contemporain de Paris. He showed the Mayakovsky exhibition, and then several others. Please tell me about the other ones, and before and after.
Before there was the Mayakovsky one, there was also a small exhibition of Sarian. Sarian was one of these artists, not at all. He was a very creative artist, one could say, well, in sort of, very much into bright colors and things like that. We would say in the French way, like a fauve, you know, something like that. And he made this exhibition because he thought that somehow on a political level of the Ministry of Culture in Moscow, they would like to have this exhibition. We never understood with Stanislas Zadora and the other curators why really, but maybe there was also some secret talks he had with them, I don't know. But afterwards we had we had the exhibition Malevich, of course, the solo show of Malevich, which was still at that time very difficult because we had mostly the collection of Amsterdam that Sandberg had acquired, and a few paintings, but very few that we had from Russia, a few ones we could smuggle, and very, very little actually. Officially, it was not supported by the Ministry of Culture yet, because it was before Paris-Moscow. And then I made this exhibition of the reconstitution of the architectons of Malevich.
But Kandinsky also you showed before.
There was also a Kandinsky exhibition. Yeah, true. Yeah.
So it's a huge and then because that is very interesting. The architectons exhibition that was shown after Paris-Moscow with Malevich abstract architectural models, and I know this exhibition was hugely influential among architects. Ram Koolhaas is one of the persons that have talked to me about that, and others also seeing this. And you curated and edited the catalog for that. So please say something more about it. It was meant from the beginning to be shown in Paris-Moscow, but there was not enough time.
No, it was enough. It came later. Well, we got a lot of sort of shoeboxes, with little plaster pieces, and then it was like archaeology. We had to reconstitute with a few photographs of the time of the late 20s that we could gather, and then reconstitute all these architectons, which were different size, but something like that. And actually, it was a Danish artist who made most of the work, Paul Petersen, who was advised to us by Truls Andersen. You have to understand that Truls Andersen was very important there. As an advisor, he was never really part of our team, but he was our best advisor because he had worked a lot on this Malevich collection of the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, and he was really the best scholar of all that classical avant-garde, Russian avant-garde. And Pontus knew him very well.
Truls is very important. He was already here in Moderna Museet. He was very important collaborator with Pontus in all Russian endeavors, starting in '66 with. So he's a great man, and
and he was director of the Silkeborg Museum afterwards.
But this so you reconstructed these models, and then. You showed it in '81.
Yep.
Was that a success? Did it have a lot of?
I cannot say it was a tremendous success. It was a great success among the artist circles, and as you said, for some avant-garde architects also. But it was in a relative small circle. It was not something for the large public.
I recommend to look in this catalog. It's available in the art library here. The Architectons from 1981, which Jean-Hubert edited. It's a great catalog, a great show. That is not very known in a wider circle. So I think it's.
The strange thing with this architecton is that they're made of little parallelepipeds of plaster, that are just connected to make some towers and finally, well, something like a pyramid, you know. Is that if you look at all the big Stalinistic buildings in Moscow, they were actually structurally, they look very much like these architectons, only they added lots of decoration and stuff on top and, you know, little glorifying things and decor and so on. But the structure, ironically, is very similar.
And this is now included in the collection in the Centre Pompidou.
Yeah,
these
it belongs to the collection. Yeah.
But it's interesting that you mention especially here Tatlin, and that I think is very important. When you talk about Pontus Hultén, you think about Duchamp, you think about Malevich, you have Picabia in a different way, but it's a little bit less known that Tatlin was very, very important, very central artist for Pontus. Trels Andersson told me that when he came to Stockholm the first time in early 60s, Pontus talked a lot about Tatlin. He was very curious. He had the impression that he didn't really know, he knew less about Tatlin at that time than he did of Malevich, but he had a very strong interest, and Trels could tell him a lot. But he had actually pictured the tower already in the 50s in their magazine, Kazark. But he became increasingly, and he was very important to his all over, and I have some theories why, but tell me why you think that Tatlin was so important for Pontus.
It's difficult to tell, but because probably he could be seen as a sort of Leonardo da Vinci of the 20th century, you know, because Tatlin was going in all directions. He was an excellent painter, but also very interested in the three-dimensional works, and he made this sort of coin sculptures that were absolutely incredible things, you know, and he very much interested also in the ship building, maybe like Pontus, who loved ships also, you know, and then, well, especially this flying machine, the so-called Le Tatlin, that is supposed to fly only with muscular strength, you know, the sort of inventions that were very similar to these many drawings and inventions of Leonardo da Vinci. I mean, it's this sort of very wide open way of thinking that is probably appealed a lot to Pontus.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that Pontus' first career dream was actually to become an architect. That's what his original intention, to become an architect. And he was always very interested in art that bordered on architecture and engineering and this, and also in the building of society. I mean, when art could intervene with society, and as he wrote, Tatlin was the one that was most involved with the building of the communist. He was the closest to the Communist Party, and he was like a society engineer in some way. I think that attracted Pontus.
Certainly, yeah. Pontus was always interested by sciences, and there were probably some exhibitions he never did that he planned more or less, or he had projects in his mind of combining art and science. And you know that he was very much, well, with Rauschenberg, Billy Clover, and this whole bunch of people, he was very much involved in the movement, art and technology also.
Yeah, and we will conclude soon here, but when we're talking about Russia, I mean, and Pontus, he had, like, it's very well known by all people that knew Pontus that he had like a great love for Russia. He loved to go to Russia, and he had a fascination, a strong fascination. He inherited this from his parents, his father especially, that made the travels, and he had, and he also had a fascination with the Soviet state, I think you must say, and the revolution. He was a revolution romanticist, as Olle Granat calls him, and I think it's
yeah, it's true. This is how the Russians called us as revolution romanticists.
But what was it that he liked with being in Moscow and Leningrad? I mean, it was
the cold vodka, who knows? But not the regime, you know. He was absolutely against the regime and hated, as I said before, all this sort of despising all individuals, you know. And I mean, and historically, he's always said Lenin was a gangster.
But your colleague Stanislas Sadora, he said that Pontus also very much like the surrealistic qualities of the communist state. I mean, these restaurants you went to, and these. You think that's true?
Yeah, there was, yeah. Well, certainly, he loved the food there, and but sometimes there were lots of surrealist situations. You know, you would go to these restaurants where we could go as foreigners, and then there was big menu with dozens of different dishes, and only a few of them had prices next to them. So we know when you already at the rest, you cannot order, and then you would find something that suits you and order it, and then the waiter would say, no, I don't recommend it. You know? So you got completely frightened, and you finally you were just choosing the dish that the waiter wanted you to choose, you know, because it was the only one or something like that. But there was all sorts of situations like that we found, of course, very funny, and we laughed about.
Yeah, there's a lot of humor. I mean, that he saw the absurdity in
yes.
Humor was always very important. But so to conclude, it's inevitable to ask. I mean, because afterwards, these shows, you became one of the leading Western experts in Russian art, I think it's fair to say, and you have been an advisor to the Pushkin Museum, and you have done many shows in France and elsewhere with the Russian content, and you have many friends there, and still the content, and you actually very recently did a show in Moscow, which ended just before the invasion, and you said that you were very happy that you were able to get the works back before this happened, and so it's inevitable to ask as a final question here about the situation today, and it's of course with your friends there and your colleagues.
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't consider myself as an expert of constructivism or Russian historical avant-garde. At the contrary, as a young curator, you know, I was organizing this exhibition, Malevich, at the Centre Pompidou, and at a certain point there was a symposium after the exhibition, and then several journalists and critics came and asked me questions about Malevich, and I had the feeling that, you know, as a curator, you suddenly become the voice of the artist, you know, and I thought, well, that's not at all what I want to do. That's nothing the way I see things. I've seen so many colleagues, you know, curators, well, becoming the specialist of one artist, you know, and making dozens of exhibitions every 2 years, but with the same artist, and then at a certain time they really feel that they are a sort of second ghost of the artist, or a sort of child of it, or whatever, you know. And this I wanted absolutely to avoid. I call myself not a because people often ask me, but your specialization is then contemporary art or modern art. I say I'm not a specialist, I'm a generalist. And this is what I've been interested in the last few years, is doing exhibitions with works of art from all periods and all cultures and mix them. Yeah. And I made an exhibition like that in the Pushkin Museum that opened at the end of last year and finished, luckily enough, the 5th of February. And the works, there were a few loans coming from Paris that just could come back in time. And what's the situation now? It's very difficult to talk about it. A few of the colleagues in museums had to be fired. I mean, the ministry right away asked, you know, for a certain person to be fired, and of course it was said that they just left the museum and so on. And many of the artists and intellectuals left, as you know. And for the ones who stay there, it's really very difficult, you know. And the colleagues at the museum, Pushkin, told me right away when the war started that there were certain questions that it's better not to mention in mails or Instagram or whatever, or you know, WhatsApp and so on. Le droit de réserve, we say in French. So I try to avoid not to mention such things in my mails with these people.
And that's a pretty sad ending to the discussion. But
very sad, yeah.
But thank you.
Thank you very much, Claes and Jean-Hubert. Now it's time for lunch on your own, and I suggest that you are back here 1:30, and we will start again with more interesting lectures on Pontus Hultén and his time. Thank you.